the very last remaining version of Aerosmith's Rock and Roller Coaster is disappearing from the Disney parks, or actually has disappeared from the Disney parks. So, what better time than right now to spend an episode talking about this ride, how it came to be, and what led to its eventual disappearance? Welcome to Factor Nostalgia, where we discuss everything theme park then, now, and when. I'm Sarah, and I'm going to be talking you through the history and current state, if we can call it that, of Aerosmith's Rock and Roller Coaster in the Disney parks. Now, in order to do that, we're going to go into the history first. Obviously, for those in the know, the Rock and Roller Coaster also had a version of that same ride in Disneyland Paris, which we're going to get to, of course, because, home park and all. But there's much more to know about this ride before we get to that point. Then lastly, we're going to talk about, what the current state of the ride is in Paris with my own personal opinions, which you might already know if you've been listening to me for a while, but we're going to repeat it anyway. And also take a look at the original version of the coaster, what happened to it, what is going to happen to it. So grab yourself a drink and a snack, and we'll get into it. Disney's Hollywood Studios opened in 1989 under the guidance of CEO at the time, Michael Eisner. It didn't open as Hollywood Studios, but as Disney's MGM Studios, as it was focused mostly on collaborations and showing the way movies are made. One of Eisner's more notorious ways of opening parks were really what are now known as half-day parks, or even back then were sometimes called half-day parks. So yes, they were theme parks. You could buy separate tickets to them, but guests often felt like they couldn't spend a full day there. So one of the comments that MGM Studios got a lot was that there weren't enough rides. So pretty soon, they started developing new rides for the park because it was still successful, but people just wanted to be able to spend more time there. Now, obviously, I'm simplifying the history a little bit, but that's because I want to get to the meat and potatoes of this episode. So bear with me. Now, the Imagineers had already sort of kept in mind that they were going to have to expand this park at some point, so there was a plot of land reserved for it. There was some back and forth about what it was going to be. They wanted to put in some Roger Rabbit stuff, which has a super interesting history, but it's way too much to get into right now. So they settled on a Sunset Boulevard themed expansion with a couple of rides. Some of the rides here would be, for example, Hollywood's Tower of Terror Hotel, which I did do an episode on recently, which I'll link to in the show notes. It is one of my favorites, if possibly my favorite ride in the parks. Now, this expansion first started happening in 1994, and there had always been plans for a roller coaster in that area, but they didn't build it at the time. Why, you ask? Well, something else happened in the early 90s, and that is the opening and complete and abysmal failure of Euro Disney, which is now Disneyland Paris. I did an episode on that as well, on the history and the problematic opening and how that all went down. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well if you're interested. But for now, let's just say it did not do well. And it was really, really a big issue for the company and for Eisner, because not only did it not make as much money as they had hoped, by far, but of course it had also cost a pretty penny to build. So they had no real timeline of, when they could recover that money, when they could recover their investment, when they could reach their ROI. So that meant that everything else had to be cut back on. But, thankfully in 1998, they announced that summer 99 would see the opening of the Rock and Roller Coaster. Now, at the time, the theming was generic enough that they thought, let's go figure out if we can find somebody to host this, a band, a rock band to host this ride. And we all know that in the end, it became an Aerosmith collab, but that was not their first pick. It wasn't even their second. So their first pick were the Rolling Stones. However, it is rumored that the Rolling Stones asked for such a ridiculous amount, somewhere between 7 and 10 million per year, to use their likeness and their songs in the ride, that Disney thought, yeah, that's a bit steep. So after this, they went, okay, who else do we have? Oh, we could ask the band Kiss. So they did. And I couldn't find numbers, but you know, again, rumor has it that they asked for even more than the Rolling Stones did. Now, at this point, they started thinking, okay, maybe we can't get it to be hosted by a band. So the fallback plan would be to use rock and roll music from the 50s, 60s, and 70s as a backdrop and not specific to any band. However, in 1998, something else happened. As we know, Disney also produced live action movies, but not under the Disney banner. And one of these movies was Armageddon, which, for those of us in the know, the Walt Disney Studios in Paris also had an Armageddon ride for a very long time. Anyway, I digress. So, this movie, Armageddon, when it came out, it had a soundtrack song. It had a really popular soundtrack song by none other than Aerosmith. They had recorded I Don't Want to Miss a Thing, a ballad, a rock ballad for the movie, and it shot to number one. It was really, really successful, and it has been Aerosmith's only Billboard top 200 number one song, if I'm correct. So, kind of a big deal. And that means that there was already a working relationship between Aerosmith and Disney. Now, Aerosmith at the time was generally, I don't want to say considered past their prime or past their heyday because I always find that a little harsh when talking about people. But, they were not at their most popular at the time. They were, however, on the cusp of a reemergence of their popularity. So this means that, Disney approached Steven Tyler specifically and asked, hey, would you and your band like to host this ride? And again, rumor has it that they asked for about a tenth of what the Rolling Stones had asked at the time, and they loved the idea. So you'll remember that they announced that the coaster would open in the summer of 99, right? You know when they announced this collaboration? June 12th, 1999. You know when the coaster opened? July 29th in that same year. So that's how short notice everything was. Anyway, for the original version, so the original ride in Hollywood Studios, Aerosmith recorded a scene. The whole idea was that as a guest, you would go in and you would get a tour of a record label, G-Force Labels. Not very creatively named, I know, but here we are. And while you're visiting a studio where Aerosmith is, busy working on a song, on Walk This Way, actually, they get interrupted by their manager and say, hey, you have a show across town. You need to leave right now or you're going to be late. Well, what about all these guests? Somebody calls out, hey, Steven, what about backstage passes? And he says, good idea. And you move through the studio and you board the coaster, which is fashioned to be after a limousine, sort of. And off you go to make it across town in time for the show where you walk the red carpet. For those of you that only know the Paris version, I know that doesn't necessarily sound familiar. We'll get to it. Now, the trains themselves, like I said, they were fashioned to be after limousines and also contained a bunch of speakers because, the music by Aerosmith had such a prominent role in the whole ride, of course. Now, they had a bunch of different trains. They had 6 different trains and they all had their own little license plate. And each train had their own soundtrack. The train with the You Go Babe license plate played Love in an Elevator and Walk This Way. There was a One Click Climo, I don't really know how to say that without showing it typed out for you, played 9 Lives. Bye-Bye had Young Lust, Fine, and Love in an Elevator, where they changed the last line of the song to Love in a Roller Coaster. Then there was a Too Fast for You, which played Sweet Emotion, which was a live version. And then finally, there was a train with a license plate, Hate Traffic, because, we do, that played Back in the Saddle and Dude Looks Like a Lady. This is the one that, stands out in my memory the most because I just remember Dude Looks Like a Lady blasting in my ear while on this roller coaster. Anyway, so those are 5 license plates with 5 trains, but there was a 6th one that they kind of alternated out, for maintenance and things like that. They would just, switch license plates around and call it a day. Now in Paris, they weren't limos, but they were soundtrackers, and they had 5 different ones. They all had, like I said, they all had their own light show. So the green light show played Back in the Saddle and Dude Looks Like a Lady. The purple light show played Young Lust, Fine, and Love in an Elevator. There was a multicolor show which also played Love in an Elevator and Walk This Way. There was one with a red light show that played 9 Lives. And finally, a blue light show theme that played Sweet Emotion, that same live version. So how do they make sure that you properly hear all these songs, you may ask? I'm very glad that you did ask. Because These weren't just your regular, you know, coaster carts. No, they had a bunch of speakers built in. And when I say a bunch, I do mean a bunch. Like each seat had 5 dedicated speakers. There were 2 mid-range speakers. There were 2 tweeters, as they are called, so for the high tones. And then each seat had a subwoofer placed under the seat, so you could honestly like hear and feel everything. And I think that's pretty cool. Now, if each train has, you can fit 4 people to a cart. Each train had 6 carts, so each train had a minimum of 120 speakers. The ride as a whole, all over, had 900 speakers. So it was a loud ride. Now, the queue for this ride was also something else. It was honestly, I loved it. The idea is you come into this recording studio, their office, and there are posters there for actual Disney recording artists, but also there were some other posters and things that would change out the names of the people performing with actual guests in the queue. They would do that based on the information they could read from the magic bands, which we don't have in Paris, so we didn't get any of that. But, cool stuff nonetheless. Now over to Paris. We got our Walt Disney Studios in 2002. It opened March 16th in 2002. And the Rock and Roller Coaster avec Aerosmith was one of the opening day rides. While the coaster itself was identical to the one over in Florida, the theming and everything around it was different. So over in Florida, they tried to make it a cohesive story with the entire Sunset Boulevard story, which didn't really work in my opinion. Like it was supposed to be some type of haunted, had something to do with the people disappearing in the Hollywood Tower Hotel. People didn't want to be involved with the record label, but then they had a resurgence when they signed Aerosmith, something like that. It was paper thin. Doesn't matter. None of that was the case in Paris. It had its own story, its own thing. Here, it wasn't G-Force Records, but Tour de Force. And rather than Aerosmith being late to a performance, here they are creating a music experience. So a music video, but more of an experience type thing, something experimental where the guests are centered rather than the band. That's the idea. So just like each train in Florida had its own soundtrack, here each train had its own soundtrack and its own light show, because the story here was so different and it was based more on music videos and experiences and things like that rather than, making it to a party in time. The track itself being the same, it didn't have all the markers of you speeding down a highway in LA, across LA, to head to this party. Instead, it was mostly strobe lights, smoke effects, things like that. People who have been on both rides often claim that the Paris version is kind of a lazy version because of that. But at the same time, I think these complaints are something that you get with every ride. It never bothered me. I really liked it because it was mostly about the music for me and the experience that we had there. And the queue in Paris, like I said, they didn't have the interaction of, the magic bands and things like that. But I loved it so much because as you enter the building, it was kind of like a little reception area. You had the signed guitars, all the different props, and then you move through the queue. And then from each big artist and big band, you had, old tour posters, memorabilia, signed knickknacks and things like that. It was amazing. I loved it. And I remember at the time, it was a very, very popular ride for a long time. They also had their fast passes in Paris. Like it was a whole thing. And at the time when it opened, it was for a very long time. I think it held the record for like 17 years and change, the fastest coaster in all of France. However, I do remember that the last couple times that I visited when it was still the Aerosmith Rock and Roller Coaster, the line started waning and the queue time started to drop significantly. At some point, it was almost a walk on. So they had closed down the fast passes, I think, even a while before. I'm not even sure if it was, at the same time they quit all fast passes or that they stopped even sooner, just because the demand wasn't there anymore. And I still don't know why or what happened, or, maybe it was other thrill rides opening or newer rides opening that just sort of lessened the demand for the rock and roller coaster. But I remember kind of having a bad feeling about it. Like, this is probably a bad sign that the crowds are waning this much. And as it turns out, my intuition was right, because in 2018, it was announced that Rock and Roller Coaster would shut down and be completely rethemed, reskinned for the new Avengers campus. I don't recall if they immediately said it at the beginning or if it was just a rumor, but it was pretty soon it became clear that it was going to be Iron Man themed. Avengers campus in Walt Disney Studios in Paris opened in 2021, and it did indeed open with the Avengers Flight Force coaster, which used to be the Rock and Roller Coaster, and the Armageddon ride that we mentioned earlier, which was sort of a special effects type event, not even really a show, more of a, yeah, not really a walkthrough, but almost. Anyway, it was a weird ride. Um, that got turned, well, that show building, I should say, because nothing else remained the same, turned into Spider-Man's web slingers. And these were the rides that Avengers Campus opened with, and still has to this day. I don't know if they're going to expand it. They could. There's obviously there's other stuff to do, but it's just that, I feel like we could have more. At the same time, I'm scared of asking for it because if you listen to the Tower of Terror episode, you know why. Anyway, to go back to the original story. After this Avengers Campus retheme of the Rock and Roller Coaster, rumors of course started swirling that something similar could happen to the ride over in Florida. Disney always, spoke out against this. No, these are just rumors. We don't have any plans for this currently, and so on and so forth. However, remember that episode I did last year around D23 when they announced all those different things coming to all the different Disney parks? And one of the things that I'm also still very excited about, and other people were as well, and people who created the memes about it at the time probably are too, is that Florida or Hollywood Studios is getting a coaster based on Monsters Inc. You know, that scene where they kind of they chase Randall across the doors, like behind the scenes with the different room doors. That is becoming a coaster, which is awesome. However, they're placing this in what used to be the Muppet themed area in Hollywood Studios, which means that the entire Muppet courtyard by now has closed, including Muppet Vision 3D, a restaurant that was there, and the whole little plaza they had, centering all of it. Now, as always, when they announce a closure of anything, people got really, really upset. Even if they hadn't been to Muppet Vision 3D in years and decades and whatnot, they'll still get upset because, how dare they? This is a different discussion, which we're not going to get into now, but it is what it is. Muppet Vision 3D closed. Now, Disney did have the idea to, you know what, let's not get rid of Muppets altogether. We do want to keep them somewhere in the park. And given that Aerosmith isn't as popular as they used to be, and I don't know what the queue situation was like for the Rock and Roller Coaster there, they thought, you know what, we can retheme Rock and Roller Coaster and make it a Muppets Rock and Roller Coaster. So that's what's going to happen. It's going to be Muppets. I have no idea what else it's going to look like. Currently, as I'm recording this, Destination D23 is still going on, but they don't really have a specific, time set for to talk about theme parks and the expansions there. Maybe they'll spend some time on the Villains Land that is coming to Florida as well. But other than that, I don't think, we can expect too much around the whole Muppets thing, or Paris for that matter. So we're just going to have to wait and see what this Muppets coaster is going to look like. It is going to be a reskin. It is, a relatively short term, for like a short time frame in which they're going to do this. It's supposed to reopen next year already. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure how elaborate it's going to be. But, let's stay positive. They probably know what they're doing. So yeah. So this is where we are today. So we have Avengers Flight Force. We have what's going to be the Muppets Rock and Roller Coaster. They might change the name around a little bit, but that's it. No more Aerosmith. While none of this is necessarily a bad thing, personal preferences aside, because clearly Rock and Roller Coaster was one of my favorites. And even when we went to Disney with like my parents and stuff, my mom, who is not that much into theme parks and definitely not into roller coasters, loved going on the Aerosmith ride. So, do with that information what you will. But, things change and that's okay. And I don't mind in keeping things up to date. I do have a problem with lazy reskins and overlays. because, I've talked about Avengers Flight Force before, where to me it feels bare. It feels like they blew all their budget on the queue. The queue is beautiful. They have some great animatronics. The story that they tell you is, engaging. You see some cameos from other Avengers and Marvel characters. It's all great fun. The ride itself still to this day feels bare to me. And a lot of that has to do with, there's a lot of screens rather than actual props, which again, to me feels lazy looking at you, Hyperspace Mountain. So yeah, I don't know. I don't love it. But then, for example, I've gone with friends and they have never been on the Rock and Roller Coaster version and they love Avengers Flight Force. I will say this, however, what I always notice for Avengers Flight Force, even if the park is crowded, I've never seen the queue go over 25 minutes. And usually when I'm there, it's between 5 and 10 minutes. So if that's any indication, I'm not the only one that feels this way. But at the same time, if you, ask around, look around, people are so enthusiastic about this ride. So, who am I to criticize? So hopefully the whole Muppet retheme, reskin will be a bit more thought out than Avengers. At least, the actual ride. I'm not sure what they're going to do with the queue. But, you know, let's see what the future holds. Who knows? Let's try not to be too negative anyway. So what about you? What do you think? Like, do you miss the Rock and Roller Coaster, or do you prefer the Avengers version, or would you also like a Muppets version? Or, should they just tear it down completely and build something else? Specifically, Paris. But if you have thoughts about the US, also do let me know. You can let me know either via comment. You can comment on YouTube or on Spotify. Apple doesn't allow for comments, unfortunately, yet. Who knows? So you can do that. You can get in touch with me via Instagram. You can do that old school through the website. I will leave all of that in the show notes so you know how to contact me if you want to. While you're looking through that, I'm going to ask you to do 3 things for me, particularly if you enjoyed this episode. If you didn't, then I don't know why you're still listening. But please share this episode with somebody who might be interested in this topic, in coasters in general, in theme parks in general, or this ride specifically. Who knows? The important thing is that you share this episode. And while you're doing that, also, in most apps, you can leave a rating and or a review. So if you would be so kind as to do that, that would really help me out. Preferably, a good one, but, whatever you're feeling. And finally, make sure that while you're doing that, you're also subscribed to the show so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you're already subscribed in the podcast playing app that you're currently using to listen to this, then why not head over to a different one and subscribe there too? Help a girl out. Anyway, with all of that, I'm going to thank you very much for listening to today's episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.